Welcome back. You're listening to A Path to Wellness on rhinoonair.com, WSPF-DB.com. And I'm Dr. Christopher Jackson, PhD, DOM, Florida. And I wanted to continue my my ad-lib talks about psychoneuroendocrine immunology. It's kind of a heady subject, but it really covers a lot of territory. When we look at things from the point of view of this overall interrelationship between all of our psychology, the way our brains work, and how we respond to life, and all our day-to-day dealings of things, and then we look at neurology and how our nervous system is part of that, endocrinology, how our glandular function, production of hormones interacts with that, and also our immune systems and how it all interplays. Now, there's something I haven't talked a lot about in all of that, and that's more of the gut relationship. So I have talked generally about psychoneuroendocrine immunology, but there's a tie-in to that. I talk a lot about the HPA axis, which is the hypothalamus, pituitary, and adrenal communication among those parts of our bodies. Hypothalamus is an area of the brain that then has just below it an area called the pituitary. It's just a little glandular structure just below the pituitary, just below the hypothalamus. Hypothalamus meaning it's below the thalamus. There's an area of the brain called the thalamus. Then we have the hypothalamus, then the pituitary. But the communication regarding all of this stuff starts with the connection with neurons going from the hypothalamus into the pituitary, and also hormonal communication that goes from the hypothalamus to the pituitary. And so we have the hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis, or the hypothalamus, pituitary, and adrenal communicating. So, that's all technical stuff, but basically what we're talking about is this connection between all of our body systems and among our body systems. It's not I hear kind of simplistic responses from people sometimes about how things work and who we are, even as people, can be defined better by understanding how all of these things interplay. And I've talked a fair amount about the psychoneuroendocrine end of it, and somewhat about the immune end of it. But what I haven't talked much about is the biota, the biology, the connection between the gut and the brain. And actually, it's more of a connection right from brain to gut to biota. And there's actual communication there between, like, we have this huge population of bacteria in our guts. Huge, like as many bacteria are in your gut as there are cells in your body. So there's a huge population of bacteria and more. It's not just bacteria. We have yeast. We have fungi. Some people say I'm a fungi, but not that. But
a little bit of Dr. Humor there. I like it.
I thought I was ad-libbing. So we have this group of these biological substances, bacteria, or life, really. The bacteria, which are a broad variety, and then we have our fungi, and then we have yeast and all these different things, protozoa, many different forms of microbial life, you could say. And there's communication in that world inside us. There's a broad range of communication that goes on. And that communication occurs between the biological substances or the biological forms. You know, I don't want to entirely say life forms, because fungi are not life forms, you know, not, well, I guess they are in a way. Actually, they are, yeah. So I'm, yeah, I guess I can say life forms in there. And so we have these various life forms within our biota that are communicating, and they're intercommunicating all the time. And the responses of the life forms within our gut change in response to us as emotional beings. When we get stressed, it changes our biology. And this is part of that connection. So we have this gut-brain connection, and it's the gut connection goes deeper into the connection between the gut and the biota, all of these life forms I'm talking about. So there's actually intercommunication there between the biology at that level, the biota, and our gut. Now, the gut structure is many formed. I mean, there's many facets to our intestinal tract. For example, there's there's the mucous membrane aspect of it, which we have a large, really throughout our bodies, we have a mucous membrane that, you know, includes our stomach lining, you know, up through to our mouth, down beyond that into our intestinal tract, our small intestines, our large intestines. So we basically, it's one large route from mouth to anus. And that is a mucosal interface with the outside world. And it, you know, there are iterations, there are sphincters in there that open and close and things like that, but it's one very long continuous path, essentially. And that's one aspect of it. And within that membrane area, we have neurons. There's an enteric neuronal system. It's, or enteric being within the environment of the intestinal tract and the gut and so on. The nervous system that applies in that area, or the nerves themselves, are as plentiful as our central nervous system. So our spinal column, for example, our spinal column, the amount of nerves within our spinal column are roughly equivalent to the amount of nerves within our intestinal tract, which kind of puts it in perspective. And a lot of people look at it as if we have basically two brains. And, you know, there were early articles on this concept decades ago, many decades ago, where we could talk about the two brains, the mind, the brain, and the gut connection. You know, so we have this neuronal connection to our guts. And so there's communication interplay between the biota and the gut, the intestinal tract. And then that communication is transferred from the intestinal tract by neurological pathways to our brain. And so it's tied into the central nervous system. It's tied into the hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis. All of these are interacting. So this kind of takes me down to the concept of intuition. Intuition, you know, we kind of see intuition as a gut feeling, right? It's a gut, like we actually can kind of feel it, you know, when we intuitively perceive something. We get a gut feeling, and we've used that term for a long time. A gut feeling, and there's some truth to that. There is communication going on between our guts and our brain. And when we sense something's wrong, we feel it in our gut, you know. Or if we feel that it's the right move, we feel it in our gut. And it's not just a conscious decision, period. That's it, you know. So a lot of things are happening at a much deeper level than we perceive with our conscious minds. In fact, if I look at it from a totally psychological point of view, for example, I'll use the percentage that I picked up in a hypnosis class I did. The percentage was given that about 12% of our brain function is conscious, leaving about 88% in the unconscious or subconscious realm. So what we perceive is derived not just from what we consciously see or sense in some way, smell, taste, whatever, but we're gathering information without necessarily being aware of it all the time. That's our subconscious mind. Constantly gathering information in our environment, you know, whatever we're doing, we're always gathering this information, which we may not be consciously aware of, you know. So I'm kind of segueing from the concept, but that is tied into it as well. You know, the intuitional aspect, we get a gut feeling, and we pick up on things that aren't necessarily consciously derived. They may be in our subconscious brain. So the activity of gathering that information may lead us to conclusions that are different from what we would if we just went straight conscious thinking all the time. And I can go further on that concept. So let's go into some examples. There's a kind of thought process called lateral thinking, lateral thought processes. And I'm kind of proud to say, because I'm half Maltese by birth, I'm kind of proud to say that this concept came from somebody by the name of Edward de Bono, who was Maltese. But he came up with this concept of lateral thought processes and wrote about it. And I've personally experienced this many times, and I'm sure everybody has, where you're thinking about something and you may not be able to, like you might be trying to solve a problem or you know, trying to come to a solution for something, and you may not be able to come up with it. And you basically take it to the point where you can't deal with it, or you can't come up with a solution, and you go on to something else. And it turns out a few minutes later, or an hour later, or a day later, it clicks. And you get the answer, the solution, pop in your head. That doesn't just happen accidentally. our mind is working on it, but it's a part of our mind that's not conscious. It only becomes conscious, basically, I guess, when we receive that solution from all that work that's been going on in our brain, in these other areas of our brain. You know, we can even visualize it as shells or layers of brain activity, you know, the conscious being at the surface more, and then we get deeper and deeper and deeper and deeper. And this kind of processing that we do can lead us to insights, and that's where that insight comes in. You know, allowing our brains to work at a deeper and deeper level. And some of that communication, again, goes back to the gut. You know, we're working on these things. It's interesting because brain activity is not the only activity for consciousness. And that's quite a statement I just made. But the brain is not the entirety of our consciousness. Much of our consciousness is actually in our gut. Much of our consciousness is carried by cells in our bodies. There are vibrational aspects to our consciousness. There's cell memory we have. This goes very deep and just many facets to it. So when we get into this connection, the brain-gut, biota, brain-gut connection, microbiota, we can see there's many layers and many levels and many aspects to it. For example, I've talked about cytokines in the past and the activity of cytokines. Well, those are chemical messengers, chemical messenger molecules. And those chemical messengers are part of how we do this communication inside our bodies. And then we have actually atomic level things going on, or you know, atomic, even subatomic things going on that are part of the communication in our bodies. We have photons being produced within our bodies. You know, conceptually, a photon is a particle of light. Well, photons are used in the communication at the lowest levels of processing within our bodies, where literally there's a blip of light that goes between two cells, or two molecules actually, in an instant. And that instant is far less than a second. We're talking like a millionth of a second. That communication is going on all over the place. So we have many, many, many levels of communication. And all of that ties back into how it all works together. So we have the psychology, the effects on our brains, the effects on our moods. Our moods are also affected by our gut biota. It goes both ways. You know, if we're stressed, it affects our biology and our microbiota, and vice versa. The microbiota affect our moods. So we have all of this interconnection. And with that vast matrix, that web of neurons that is within our intestinal tract, a lot of that communication is instantaneous. That's another way, because, and when I say instantaneous, really I'm talking speed of light. Okay, which, you know, now I'm talking relativity here, but Einstein basically took the idea of instantaneous action, or the concept, it actually was a Galileo concept, was that there are no instantaneous interactions there are no instantaneous interactions, period. And therefore that there must be a limit, is what Einstein said. Einstein came up with the concept of a limit based on Galileo's concept of relativity. So the theory of relativity was defined from that. So this sounds like I'm going off, but actually this all pertains to the rapid communication that goes on within our bodies. The communication that happens in our neurons is at the speed of light, which Einstein defined as the limit. So there are no instantaneous interactions in nature. That's Galileo's concept. And then Einstein took that concept and made the mental leap. Well, if there are no instantaneous interactions in nature, there must be a limit. And he defined the limit as the speed of light. So that things are happening very, very rapidly at the speed of light when we're talking about the electrical signals that are happening in our neurons. So we have this rapid communication going on there. We have the communication among the biota themselves, you know, among the bacteria, among the microbial life forms that are within our bodies. The cell communication, intracellular communication. All of these things are going on within our gut. And yet they tie right back into our nervous systems, our central nervous system, and our brain, essentially, which is part of that whole nervous system. And then we also have a tie-in to the sympathetic response as well as the parasympathetic response. The sympathetic response is that fight or flight response, the reactive kind of response that affects our heart rate and blood pressure and many other things. And then we have our parasympathetic response, which also affects those issues, but in an opposite direction, essentially, because it's more of a relaxation response, which was actually also a term coined by, I believe, Herbert Benson back in, I think, the 60s, 70s, 80s, something like that. He was a Harvard MD that coined the term the relaxation response. And there was a book out at that point in time. He followed that up with another book called I'm Okay, You're Okay, which a lot of people have read or heard of.
Yeah.
That was a while back, yeah. But you see, a lot of this kind of thinking was going on back then, and understanding and research was happening a long time ago. So it's all rooted in research that began many moons ago, and we're making progress now. We're getting to understand much more about the psychoneuroendocrine immunological connections that are within our bodies. I've had some, I'm currently working on another PhD, and I've had some of the current professors who have been totally unaware of even this term, psychoneuroendocrine immunology. They know about psychoneuroimmunology. Not really, a lot of them don't really include the endocrine system in there, but it's a huge issue. It's a huge part of that interconnection. And when you can connect all of these aspects, you understand how the body works very well. and it can help us to have insights into how to approach different kinds of issues that come along in health or psychology, if you want to. We can include that as health, but mental health or physical health, physiological health. So, so we have this interconnectedness between our psychological responses, our endocrine responses, again glandular, our neurological responses, and our immune responses. Now, there are many aspects to the immune response that are involved in the activity of the biology that goes on, the microbial life that goes on in our gut. And for example, in our guts, we create a lot of our antioxidants. We create our B vitamins, these kinds of things. And the action of those nutrients within our bodies helps to repair damage that's done through natural biological processes, as well as damage from our environments, damage from food choices, damage from many things that occur. Okay, stress. All of these things have an oxidative reaction to them. Reactive oxygen species are created, otherwise known as free radicals. Free radicals are created and they wreak havoc within our bodies. They go through and strip off electrons off of molecules throughout our bodies, which means that we suddenly have ionized molecules or ions that weren't present in a more neutral environment where those molecules had their electrons. And antioxidants they have extras. They have extra electrons in their structures. So they provide donor electrons, we can call them. And those donor electrons substitute or go into the place where the prior electrons existed and neutralize those molecules. So they essentially repair the damage that's done by free radicals. Hopefully I'm breaking things down in such a way that they make sense, because this is pretty deep stuff, a lot of it. It's interesting how all this works together, but a lot of that activity is happening within the gut. So we want to take care of our gut. We want to eat good nutritional foods. We don't want to be eating a lot of sweets. Sweets will fuel what we call bad bacteria, candida, different things that are going on in our gut if we eat too many sweets. Yeah.
Gut, you're referring to our intestines?
Intestinal tract.
Okay, so the intestinal tract is the gut.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And then colon, what relationship does the colon have with all that?
The colon is toward the end of the process. Yeah. But basically
because recently I heard of a compressed colon. I have no idea what that means.
Yeah.
So I'm thinking, okay, so there's, and that whole tract there's a other area there that also pertains though to the gut, correct?
Yeah.
If I were to think of the body in two brains, let's say, so the colon would pertain more to the brain of the gut.
Yes.
Than to the one of the thoughts.
That's right. Yeah. So
that makes sense.
Yeah, that's good. Good question.
I'm listening.
Clarify. You're helping me clarify. Thank you. So yeah, we can have issues within our gut. For example, we can have an inflamed area within our gut. You mentioned a compressed colon. Well, sometimes we have sort of an overlapping that happens between the small intestine and the large intestine, where they come together, and that area can become inflamed. We can have all sorts of other things going on, like diverticula, right? Diverticulitis, where we have inflammatory, sort of little spots of inflammatory areas that somehow or another have gotten there, and there's lots of different ways that can happen. But those areas then lend to an inflammatory environment that can be exacerbated by eating the wrong foods, by having foods that don't provide the antioxidants, or like from your food. I mean, you're getting some of your antioxidants from your food, and then you produce some in your gut, but not all of them can be produced. For example, vitamin C is something that we don't create in our guts. We have to get it from our food, you know, versus B12 we can create in our gut. And if
what do you mean by we can create in our gut?
The bacteria actually generate the vitamin.
B12, we can actually reproduce B12.
We create it in our gut, yeah.
And then from there it gets distributed to the rest of the body?
Right, yeah, through our bloodstreams. Mm-hmm.
Wow.
Yeah, so we have processes going on in our bodies where we can produce a lot of the nutrients that we need.
But that still would happen through the process of eating properly, or how does that happen?
Right, so it happens through that process, through eating, and we get some of the nutrition from our food, but some of it is actually produced within our gut. Yeah, yeah. And, you know, we have actually the action of vitamins is an interesting aspect as well, because not only do we have the antioxidant properties, but we, boy, I lost my train of thought. I have to catch a new one.
We were talking about the creating the B12 and how it creates and travels.
Right. So, yeah, we create B12. There are various nutrients we create, but there are some nutrients we cannot create, and vitamin C is one of those. So, anyway, so we have a lot of interactions, a lot of things we depend on, and there are some people who can not create adequate levels of some of the vitamins. For example, those who have the MTHFR genetic marker are likely not to be able to produce enough folate. And this can lead to inflammatory issues. This can lead to, for example, homocysteine being elevated. Homocysteine is a protein that is an indicator of inflammation within the body. And it's actually pretty much as good a marker as cholesterol levels in terms of understanding cardiovascular health. So that's an important one to check. But if you have the MTHFR gene, then you may not be able to produce enough folate, and that can affect the balance of your nutrients in your gut and being produced within your gut. And then that leads to more inflammatory issues, which can elevate your homocysteine. All right, so again, this all gets pretty deep, but basically to understand more simply, we have this interrelationship that goes on between our minds and our guts. And if we look at it on a more complete level, and we're talking about psychology, brain, you know, up here, this brain, interacting with our neurological systems, which the brain is part of, our neurological central nervous system. And then we have the endocrinology, the glandular interface, and I talked earlier about the connection between the hypothalamus and the pituitary, and the pituitary is connected both neurologically and hormonally with the hypothalamus, and much of the activity that occurs is on both levels. So we have this both an endocrine connection and a neurological connection. The endocrine connection, again, has to do with our glands and hormone levels and these kinds of things, and the activity of those and how it affects our bodies. And then we also have the neurological connection, which again ties into the brain through the hypothalamus and the pituitary connection. But then we also have neurological connections that are more the neuroendocrine connections, or neurohormonal. Many of our hormones are neurologically active. In other words, they affect our neurology, not just our hormone levels, not just our metabolic rates, not just our sexual hormone levels, but all of these types of things. Our metabolism, there's many facets to it, but also the neurological connection. So, and that connection with the brain. So we have this interplay going on, and it's really probably more appropriate to talk about not psychoneuroendocrine immunology even, but to process them in a less linear viewpoint. Even just defining the word gives you more of this understanding or this concept of a linear connection and a linear interaction, where you would think if it's psychoneuroendocrine immunology, you have to, and I'm being very analytical here, but psycho would have to connect with neuro, and then neuro to endocrine, and then endocrine to immune. For example, if it's psychoneuroendocrine immunology, well, what if it's psychoendocrine neuroimmunology? What if it's also psychoimmunological, neurological, and endocrine? You see what I mean? So it's really all of them interacting simultaneously as opposed to in a linear fashion, because many of these facets are going on at a given time. All of them are interplaying simultaneously and pretty much continuously, so that it's more of a three-dimensional, or even beyond that, reality that is occurring. It is not a linear relationship, and that's kind of important to understand, that this is all happening simultaneously. That, yes, there are some specific routes that are taken, but that doesn't mean that these are isolated events, that have to happen in a certain sequence per se, because many of these interactions are happening simultaneously. So we have cellular communication, we have biological communication among even the bacteria in our guts, we have molecular and even atomic or even subatomic communication going on. We have the generation of photons I was mentioning, and this very quick communication that happens there. It's almost, you could kind of conceive it as digital, like a switch being turned on or off. That kind of a pulse can occur and be communication. And that is occurring all the time, many, like 1 million times a second throughout our body. So there's so many things going on here that keep our bodies going and keep these processes in development and continuous continuous action. So, you know, we can talk about the various facets of the brain. And, you know, we have our hindbrain, we have our hypothalamus, our thalamus, hypothalamus, pituitary, the limbic system, and then the interaction with that and the adrenal glands, for example. That's the hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis. But we also have a hypothalamic pituitary gonadal axis, which is interacting with our hormones by intercommunicating with our gonads, meaning ovaries or testicles, and again, many other axes. And the one that I brought up today is the microbiota gut brain axis. And so we have many facets to how things are working and how they affect our psychology, our emotional makeup, variations in our emotions. These kinds of things are affected by what's going on in our gut. You know, we have more serotonin in our gut than we do in that brain in our head, by far. I believe the figure is about 95% of the serotonin in our bodies is in our gut. So much of our emotional makeup is actually in our gut. And there is that connection that's been shown to emotions, or between emotions, and some of these syndromes that occur within our guts, like IBD or IBS, irritable bowel syndrome, Crohn's disease. Many of these kinds of things are inflammatory disorders that occur and are connected to our emotions through our gut. So we have so many layers and so many levels of action within our bodies. And everything going on has some effect somewhere else in our bodies. So everything is constantly interacting and interplaying to produce our emotional responses, to respond to our emotional responses, you know, to respond to our thoughts, to respond to the stressors in our lives, to respond to our environments, and you know, through many levels. This can be neurological responses, this can be endocrine or hormonal responses, and this can be immune response. So if we're getting sick all the time, for example, you know, if we catch every cold that is out there, then we need to work on that immune response. That immune response can be helped quite often through the use of antioxidants, for starters, but also there are substances that help to increase the levels of our immune cells. So white blood cell activity, also things like natural killer cells, T cells, which are immune cells that are derived from the thymus, and then there's B cells that are immune cells that are derived from our bones. And all of these have action in our immune response. So we need to address those to a certain extent. And then we can look at our gut from the point of view of how healthy is that gut? Do we have the right biological makeup? Do we have something going on in there that's challenging our immune system? You know, are we developing bacteria that use up a lot of our energy, that may make it difficult for us to fight a cold or something along those lines? So one of the aspects of addressing those issues may be, to address the root cause, maybe to address the biology, to help to improve the biology, to help improve the immune system and the immune response. It's not just about, taking an antibiotic. In fact, an antibiotic can be counterproductive. If you have a biological illness, like bronchitis or pneumonia or something along those lines, antibiotics can, yes, they can help to target the specific pathological issue, the specific problem bacteria, but then the problem is that they don't generally target that well. In other words, they're destroying not only the good bacteria, not only the bad bacteria, but the good bacteria. So we end up with an area within our intestinal tract that we've now killed off some of the good bacteria that we want to flourish while we killed off the bad bacteria. So now we need a probiotic to help to encourage the development of the good bacteria, to improve that balance, bring it back into homeostasis, bring our guts to a place where our immune response can be good and where we're not affecting our emotions and other things that can be involved with a negative environment within our guts. So we have many aspects to this whole topic, but the immune response is tied into what I just was talking about. And then we have the interplay with the nervous system and the connection into the gut or the intestinal tract, and that matrix or net or web, if you want to call it, of neurons that's within the area of our intestinal tract. And then we have the mucosa and possibly responses of the mucosa within that area, like there may be inflammation that occurs if we're not addressing the gut needs, or we may address the gut needs, but that inflammation may have been created already, so we also then need to address that inflammation. There's many ways of doing that. You don't have to pop an ibuprofen or an Advil or whatever, any your given form of NSAID, which, by the way, can be very destructive, can damage your liver. A lot of people, thousands of people every year, are ending up in the hospital from the use or abuse of NSAIDs. And actually thousands, probably tens of thousands are ending up in the hospital from it, but actually thousands are dying from the use of over-the-counter, non-sterile anti-inflammatory drugs. So there are other ways, more natural ways of doing that. For starters, eating an anti-inflammatory or a non-inflammatory diet. An anti-inflammatory diet can include things like cold water fish, wild caught cold water fish, not farm raised. It can include eating lots of vegetables, lots of green leafies, lots of a broad variety of vegetables. And a not so great diet that can lend to inflammation includes the meat and potatoes diet, for example. That's an inflammatory diet. If your bulk of your proteins is beef, and then the only vegetable you eat is potatoes, you're up a creek. That's going to really cause a lot of inflammation. You really need the antioxidants from a broad variety of vegetables, and that's aside from what you produce within your body. You really need this, because these antioxidants, the vitamins, are coenzymes in processes throughout your body. They catalyze the processes. They help to create the energy in your body, the energy in your cells, for example. They help to repair many facets of the damage that's done through reactive oxygen species or free radicals, etc. So we need to pay attention to these things. You know, there's so many aspects to this. So anyway, I'm sure that was a little on the complicated side, in the fact that we're dealing with a lot of issues at different levels within our bodies and the activity of many parts of the biology of our bodies. But as you can see, it all is tied together. You know, it's like Anne-Marie's show called Connect the Dots. You know, if we connect the dots are all over the place. There is not a single line from those dots.
Which dots are you talking about?
We're talking about a three-dimensional, at least, group of dots. We're talking about matrices and tensors, not lines and triangles.
But to connect those dots, there's lines in between. So the only reason why I specify that, because we are all connected. I mean, life is life, even when you go to you know, trees, and so that's the only reason why we don't want to give a mislead in that thought process.
That's right. That interconnection goes actually beyond what we perceive as our physical bodies.
Correct.
Yeah, and that's real. I mean, it's not obvious and it's not visible, but it's real. We are electromagnetically interconnected as well. All that energy flow going on in our bodies, the electromagnetic field created by that energy throughout our bodies expands to our environment and even interconnects us with not only each other, but there is a source or a point in space known as the 0 point in space, and that 0 point is where we have this convergence of the fields within space, within our universe connecting. So we've got a huge interconnection, and it's something that probably is part of that, or at least drawn into that subconscious aspect to our beings that I talked about. Estimate about 88% of our brain activity is not conscious, right? Or for some individuals, it may be more like 98%, depends how you look at it. Thinking about particular politicians, but anyway, so there's a lot to this. There's a lot to it. We're like walking universes, you know, individually. Each of us has millions, trillions of lives within us,